who has been seriously reconnecting and doing it in a place where there are a myriad of problems. And he refused to move up into the hills, and he stayed in the valley, in his neighborhood and in our community, building the Black Family Life Center, maintaining his position at San Francisco State in Black Studies, alongside brothers like Dr. Obata Chaka, and maintaining his work in the field of African consciousness, working with the Melanin Consortium as they opened up the first Melanin Conference in San Francisco, working with the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilizations, working with the National Council of Black Studies. He was with me, Roslyn, and others in Ghana last year. And this year, his profession that he has chosen, psychology, his brothers and sisters, his African support system, has crowned him their chief pharaoh, their Nana, the president of the Association of Black Social Workers, Black Psychologists. And I present you my brother, my partner, doing yeoman work with the Hawk program and McClymonds Center, yeoman work, Dr. Brother Wade Nobles, the husband of Vera Nobles.
The best part of what my brother said about me is that I am Vera's husband. You may not really understand how significant that is because we don't understand what makes us human. And what I hope to do this evening is talk about what makes us human in the context of education. Before I do that, you all know I must ask you all to allow me to assume a posture of reverence and respect while I give praise and credit to the source of all knowledge and all truth. And I do that by saying out loud that the Almighty, who is sometimes called Amun, and is sometimes called Aset, and is sometimes called Ptah, and is sometimes called Sheshat, and is sometimes called Jehovah, and is sometimes called Obatula, and is sometimes called the Christ, and is sometimes called Oshun, and is sometimes called Shango, and is sometimes called Allah, and is sometimes called Oya, and is sometimes called Olutumari, and is sometimes called Atum, that Almighty God, Amun, Ptah, Ra, although hidden, is the source of all knowledge, all truth, and all wisdom. And I pray in what I share with you this evening that Amun, Tehuti, Orumila will be satisfied. I am supposed to, through protocol, bring you greetings from the National Association of Black Psychologists that I have the honor of leading as their national president, from the Department of Black Studies and the School of Ethnic Studies at San Francisco State University, and from the Institute for the Advanced Study of Black Family Life and Culture. And I bring you greetings from these places because these are the places, with the addition of ASCAC, that has nurtured the thinking that I believe is going to be critical in the liberation of the African mind. I am not going to talk to you about the battles that are happening in California under the guise of the initiatives that are looking at how do we begin to talk about as a policy question African-centered education for the state of California. That is something that is an interesting battle, but it's one that I have decided not to talk about tonight because it really is a political battle that has to do with policies and strategies, and those are issues that we need to talk about in another kind of session. Strategies and tactics are not public forum information. I'm not going to talk about the McClymonds project, even though I think that is an exciting endeavor and that we have been able to have a school district in California to designate an entire high school as a place where that is predominantly serviced by the black community, to be a school that is designed to be a science, culture, and technology high school with an African-centered foundation. I think it's exciting that we're able to marry Afrocentricity with science and technology in the service of educating black children. I don't want to talk about that this evening because I think that that's also an important experiment and an important project. But what's more important is for us to look at this question that I've been given in terms of my topic, multiculturalism and African-centered education, the meaning for Africans. And I want to put that aside very quickly because I think that the discussion about multiculturalism is one that can be handled easily. It doesn't exist. We don't need to talk about it. We don't need to talk about it other than to say that in a free and open society, multiculturalism should be the foundation of good education. End of question. We don't have a free and open society. We have a society that has seen fit to its own understanding to talk about the destruction of African people, and therefore Africans to talk about multicultural society is testament to the kind of insanity that you all need to have black psychologists address. So I will go on record. If you talk about multicultural education in a non-free and open society, then that's an indicator of pathology, and that we need to really talk a different way of looking at it. I have suggested that in my own work that the question for us that's so critical and that frightens me almost daily is the issue of us having intellectual clarity that guides our struggle. And too often I think, and it may be just my problem, but too often I believe that our struggles end up failing because we haven't taken the time to struggle with the intellect before we struggle with the conflict. And because we don't do that, we end up losing a great deal more than what we should lose. In my work, I've argued that power is the ability to define reality and to have other people respond to your definition as if it were their own. That's an important definition in and of itself. Power is the ability to define reality. And I would suggest to you this evening that the most important reality to define is the meaning of our own human beingness. No other reality is important to define than how we define what it is to be a human being. All the systems that we create, educational systems, family systems, political systems, military systems, social systems, psychological systems, all the systems that we create, if we don't first take authority for defining the meaning of our own human beingness, then all those other systems will not serve us well. And education is prime example of not serving it well. When I was asked to talk about multiculturalism by Brother Lionel, I told him I didn't know if I wanted to do that, that I thought it was easy. I mean, it takes a minute to do that. It doesn't exist. Go back to California. And I didn't want to come all the way here and just say that and go back to California. And so I sent him another topic that I thought I wanted to talk about, and I want to use that as a way of looking at this question of intellectual clarity. I thought that it would be important to give myself an opportunity to talk about the Maafa, or the Black Holocaust, African-centered education, or multiculturalism, a quest for clarity and truth. And I want to use this notion of the Maafa as a way of talking about clarity, because the issue of what happens to us and what we determine to happen to us has to be driven by clarity, has to be driven by truth. And for a long time, we have taken the strategy as intellectuals of simply putting black in front of it and saying that is our fundamental, essential theorizing. That's the best that we could do. We took black and put it in front of it. So whether it was Marxism, we put black in front of it and say we can do that. If it's socialism, we put black in front of it and say we can do that. We even take this notion of our atrocity and put black in front of it and say that that represents our issue. We did not experience a Holocaust. We did not experience a black Holocaust. Other folk have had a Holocaust, and it is, in fact, a tragedy that they experienced. But our tears cannot be shed for someone else's tragedy. But more importantly, we cannot put our experience in someone else's paradigm and call it black and make it our tragedy. Marimba Ani, Remember, Anish serves our community well when she suggests in her analyses that the Maafa is better as a concept for representing what, in fact, happened to African people. It is not a black Holocaust. The Maafa, according to Marimba, is a great disaster of misfortune, of death and destruction beyond human comprehension and convention. Now, you need to hold on to that notion. Experiencing a system of death and destruction beyond human comprehension and convention. A Holocaust literally comes from the Greek meaning holocaustos, to burn whole. And because some folk got mad at their own relatives and decided as a political strategy to burn them up whole, is their family business. That ain't none of our business. We are not guilty of it. We are not responsible for it. We don't have to worry about it. They should take care of that issue. Our experience from our own authentic voice is to recognize that we experience a system of death and destruction that was beyond human comprehension and convention, and what made it beyond human comprehension and convention is that the Maafa requires the denial of the validity of the humanity of the African. Let me say that again, because that's an important point. The Maafa requires the denial of the validity of the humanity of the African. Some Africans get up and start talking about some Afrocentric education. The response that is required is that you must be in opposition to that because you must deny the humanity of the African. And only human beings recognize that their divine responsibility is to reproduce and refine the best of themselves. That's what education is. Education is a process by which we reproduce and refine the best of ourselves. And so by Africans saying we want an African-centered education, where we center the development of African people in an African understanding of the world, that read too much like human thinking. Yeah. That sounded too much like a people who were in touch with their own humanity. And so in order to keep the Maafa going forward, one simply had to say, no, that Afrocentric stuff is these crazy African intellectuals in these universities running around wearing African clothes and creating a cult following and doing all this strange stuff, or poor Martin Luther King would turn over in his grave because they're against integration, and all these things, because it wasn't about any of that. It was about taking authority for defining our reality. Power is the ability to define reality and to have other people respond to their definition as if it were their own. The Maafa represents the attempt to systematically destroy, create death and destruction in people. The best death in an exploitive society is the death of one's mind, because you keep their behinds to do the work. The best death is to destroy our minds, and you destroy that through the process of education. It is not, education should not be this major issue that people are now writing about. We're causing the disuniting of America. I mean, a couple of kids in a room with a blackboard. I mean, it shouldn't be that major kind of issue. The reason why it's so major is because they understand far better than us. And that's why clarity in the intellectual struggle is so important. They understand far better than us that when we reclaim the authority to educate our children, we are reclaiming the authority to reproduce the future. And if we take mastery over the future, then oppression ceases to happen. That's the issue. The issue boils down to two laws that I think we should somehow translate into a system that we share with our children. And it comes out of something that I'm calling the duality of knowing and being for Africans living in a non-African reality. See, that's an amazing thing. We are Africans living in a non-African reality. How we master, manipulate that reality requires serious, serious thought. Because we can end up having education. They can give it. My major fright is that the white folks will say, forget it, y'all take it and go with it. Whatever you want, we'll give you the money. Whatever you want, you can do. And we will, I guarantee you, do exactly the same thing that they have been doing for the last 300 years. Because we have not taken the time to understand what it means to be Africans in a non-African reality. And so all we can do is produce what is consistent with a non-African experience because we haven't got in touch with ourselves as being African. The duality of knowing and being for Africans living in non-African reality is driven by I'm calling two laws. And so I have the authority to do that. I'm a scientist. So I can just say this is a law. Because I understand what laws mean in terms of scientific method. And the law of the first law is the law of misknowing. It comes out of Neely Fuller's work, and it's not something that you all aren't familiar with. You're very familiar with it. It has to do with white supremacy. The law of misknowing says if you don't understand white supremacy, then everything else you think you know will simply confuse you. That's a law. That's a law. It is predictable. It is consistent. It happens exactly the same way every single time. If you don't understand white supremacy, then everything else you think you know will simply confuse you. We struggle with pedagogy. We struggle with classroom practice. We struggle with developing curriculum. We struggle with all these things of education. But if we don't understand white supremacy, then what we invent and call African-centered education will be detrimental to the development of our own children. We have to keep that in mind. We have to keep in mind that there is this law of misknowing. And a lot of what we do is driven by misknowing, not knowing. The second law comes out of my own work that I call the law of non-being. The law of non-being. I think it is the most essential, critical law. It says if you don't exist according to your own African essence, then everything else you think you are will only be a diminishment. Let me say it again because that goes right by you. If you don't exist according to your African essence, then everything else you think you are will be a diminishment. I'm Dr. Wade Nobles, chairman of some department, director of some of that. But if I do all of that stuff, boss this, PhD that, director this, supervisor that, all those things that we think we are, if they are not aligned with our African essence, they become an example of our lessening. It is not an achievement to be the chairman of the Black Studies Department if your chairmanship is not aligned with your African essence. It is not an achievement to be the supervising physician in the psychiatric ward on floor 3 if your doing psychiatric work is not in alignment with your African essence. The law of non-being says if you do not exist according to your African essence, then everything we think we are is a diminishment, is a lessening of who we are. And we have to then begin to talk about how do we, if those two laws are correct, how do we begin to look at the educational system to make sure that the educational system address these issues for our children, because our children are doing what we did. We went through the educational process and we come out with this haunting, quiet voice in the back of our minds that maybe we got through on the humbug. That maybe we really are not quite as competent, quite as confident, quite as capable as someone else. We all will talk all this good stuff about being the sons and daughters of great kings and queens from Africa, but when we look in our quiet rooms in that mirror behind the doors closed, and we don't have anyone else to confess to, we walk away believing that maybe we just don't got it. Not because it was internal to us, intrinsic to us, it was because the system was designed to do what? Invalidate the humanity of the African. That the Maafa is designed to invalidate the humanity of the African in everything we do. All of us run around hoping that no one looks and see what year we graduated with our PhDs because that was the time there was affirmative action programs. And we believe that maybe we got our PhD because of affirmative action a benefit and not because of the integrity of our scholarship and our intellect. The Maafa is a systematic process of invalidating the humanity of the African. And it works in all kinds of ways. It works with brothers. No, we go out and we decide to go out on a date. And we see a young lady, take her to a date. The first thing we think about when we get ready to go on that date is how we get the flowers. We get all the good stuff to have. We get the flowers, we get the stuff, we get cool, we get clean and cool. But we're walking to go out with our loved one. And the consciousness that haunts us is I hope I don't go down to this new cool restaurant and some fool mess with me and don't serve me right. I sit there and I clock it. Damn, I was here. Them people over there came in 20 minutes later. They got this thing. All of that is systematic to attack our humanity, to make us think that there's something wrong with us, that issues, all those things that we used to call discrimination weren't discrimination. See, that's the clarity of our movement. We thought it was discrimination, therefore we needed a civil rights movement to get our rightful position. It was far more insidious than that. It wasn't about no civil rights. It was about that this society will not allow us to exist as Africans because it is required that African people be believed to be not valid human beings. And we run around trying to be like, walk like, look like, talk like, be like anything but African because it's designed to do that. The Maafa is an important concept, so we need to begin to use our own experience and talk about our own concepts and not just in blackanize it because white folks got it. They got boogie nose disease. We say, we got the black boogie nose disease. And we call that scholarship. You know, we run around and just put black on anything that they come up with and they call that scholarship. They're now talking about, you mentioned about black homophobia. We don't know what our relationships are in terms of sexuality. Don't even understand the metaphysics of of feminine principles and masculine principles in the universe. But we're going to run around now, people talking about you got to accept me because no, you sick. Period. And we need to move on. We need to understand our own experience and then begin to talk about some principles that allow us to do that. That's what the school does. The school is the institution. It is the formal institution to validate and to reinforce our value system. These schools are not neutral. They're not neutral places where we just come and teach mathematics. There's culture there. And that culture, in growing that culture, is a value system, and that's why we're struggling with this notion of Afrocentric education. It is tied to this notion of colonialism, another concept we need to rethink and revisit. We've been taught in these places that colonialism is a political system. It's a political arrangement where, in fact, some country dominates another country and exploits their natural resources. The only thing true about that definition is that colonialism is an arrangement. That's what the word literally means. Colonialism literally means organization and arrangement. And it is rearrangement. If we look at our experience in terms of this notion of Maafa, what we in fact see is that there's been the singular goal of European colonialism was to rearrange the African. It really wasn't about the resources. It really wasn't about the land. It really wasn't about the politics. It was about how do you rearrange the African. Look at the world. Look at your history. Every single place that Europe has gone and had contact with Africa, the only thing that drove the dynamic was a desire to transform, to rearrange the African or things African into fundamentally non-African constructs. So everything. You're going to work in a bank. You can't work in a bank and have loop earrings on. What kind of foolishness is that? I mean, my gold loop earrings keep you from counting dollars? I mean, you see, but the fact of the matter is that the task here was to rearrange the African. You can't have a work environment that has music in the background. Why not? Because the task here is to rearrange the African. Everything is about rearranging us. And we are now participating in the arrangement. We participate in the arrangement, and it works in very insidious ways. Colonialism works in terms of the land question, which we political scientists always like to talk about, that you in fact are able to acquire and distribute and exploit the natural resources of a community, or you create the quality of life in the community. It is not accidental that you can go to any black community around the world, not just the United States, and you see a certain kind of treatment that's tied to the Maafa and tied to rearrangement. You can, in some black communities, you can't get it on Valentine's Day, get your loved one a Valentine's card and walk down to the block and put it in a mailbox. Because the mailbox is not in the community anymore. Mailbox. Your baby gets sick and you can't go to a drugstore on the corner and get some medicine because there's no drugstores in the community. You can't get your check. Oh, Lord, I got a job. I got some money. Go to cash your check. There's not a bank in your community. All these things are not accidental. They're part of a systematic process to internalize in our minds that we must be less than human. That human communities, Human communities have all those things that establish a certain quality of life that is meaningful in terms of the necessities of developing our children. So the domination of the physical space is an arrangement question. The presence of police in our community, the absence of resources in terms of sanitation and health and other quality of life indicators is an example of the arrangement. The management of the indigenous modes of production, that's what you political science like to talk about, the managing of indigenous modes of production is an arrangement. What product is the most critical, most important product to produce? Our children. Our children. And if someone else takes authority for managing how we produce our most critical product, we have been rearranged. We have been rearranged. What are the two areas where the arrangement, where the production of children occurs? The family and the school. The family and the school. It is actually a trilogy. It's the family, the school, and the church. The place where you have a connection to the divine. And all three of those places have a singular mission: to reproduce and refine the best of ourselves. The family does it, the church does it, the school does it. Except we know in a non-open, non-free society that the only place that we had total control of it for the longest time was the church and the family. But as the church became more and more arranged or rearranged, the church became less and less of a place where we were able to reproduce and refine the best of ourselves. And quiet is kept as we became more and more involved in these places. We begin to learn about family life that made us believe that our family life should be a template that Ozzie and Harry could fit over and there'd be no empty spaces. That we should match up with white folks' notions of what family was about. And so we begin to question whether or not our families were operating, functioning in a proper way, because these places told us that the black family had something intrinsically wrong with it, because we were, in fact, developing at that time in a more authentically African form of family than we do today. So we start taking on other folks' notions. The control of the modes of production is an arrangement. But the most critical area of colonialization, area of rearrangement, is the reformation of the mind. The reformation of the mind. You replace a people's life essence and their ability to tap into that life essence when you control how they think about themselves. And all this stuff is not accidental. All these imaging about black people is not accidental. It's tied to this rearrangement. It's tied to this notion of the Maafa. Every time they talk about imaging of black people, Live at 5, cops, police in action, what do you see? You see black folk in this see-me side of life. You see these imaging that are subliminal, that are tied to the invalidation of what it is to be a human being. You know, the drug bust where the door gets knocked down and the lights are flashing all over and making little sort of zoom lenses and stuff, and black people are scurrying like roaches. Scurrying like roaches. That stuff is not... How much tape was on the floor, the cutting room floor, before they got that 1 3-second scene? You see, there's a whole lot of tape on the floor. But we don't see that. We see the 3-second scene that gives us the subliminal message that we respond to, like roaches running away from light, the light of day. That's part of this Maafa. That's part of this notion of the rearrangement, to rearrange our minds. It's systematic. And the school and education has to counter that, as well as the home place and the church place. This notion of rearranging the mind is systematic. It's systematic. The best example I can give you of how systematic is for you to think. Some of you old people who lived on a farm can really see this. How we create a sheepdog. Do you know how a farmer creates a sheepdog? It's a systematic process. A farmer takes the dog as a puppy right from its mother's womb, takes that puppy and it traumatizes it by pulling it from its mother's womb. And then he takes that puppy and he places that puppy's eye against the eye of a sheep. Young puppy, all the puppy can see is a sheep. And the puppy begins to internalize that all that is holy is the sheep. And then it takes the puppy from the eye-to-eye contact and it puts the puppy at the breast of the sheep, and this puppy suckles the sheep rather than its own mother. And the puppy learns very quickly that its very life, its sustenance, is dependent upon the sheep. And as the puppy grows and gets stronger, the farmer does the most diabolical thing yet. It enters into the corral an old, sick, weakened dog. And the puppy's territorial imperatives causes that puppy to attack the weakened dog. The weakened dog cannot defend itself, so the puppy becomes victorious. And the farmer immediately rewards the puppy for destroying the dog. Look at the process. Look at the process. Take black children immediately away from their mother, called culture. Called culture. You traumatize them with television. You place them eye to eye with the beauty and the power of whiteness. All we see in this country, this is the Maafa, all we see in this country is that all that is holy, including Jesus Christ himself, is whiteness. And then we are taught that our very sustenance depends upon getting that good white job. We can get a good job, a government job. We get one of those with a security, we then are secure. And then the diabolical aspect of this transformation process is that you enter into the arena a weakened, sick, old images of black folk. And what do? We attack it. We attack it ourselves because we have become sheepdogs. We have become sheepdogs rather than scientists. We have become sheepdogs rather than saints. We don't understand the process, and Schoolhouse is a critical player in this. See, Schoolhouse is a critical player in this. When the Schoolhouse teaches us in the curriculum that all that black folks did was pick cotton and that Abraham Lincoln freed us, that's sheepdog creating. See, that's attempting to remove us from our fundamental nature of who we are. We learn these things when we begin to see that every time you talk about black things, then we get nervous. We get nervous because why? That's the sheepdog response. Every time we say we needed black folk to come together and work together, we say, no, what about those other folk? You know, we're going to offend those other folk. That's the sheepdog response. You see, that's the attacking response. Every time we look at issues about what's good for our children, we say, what's good for our children? People attack and say, wait a minute, what about those other kids? We say, you're right, what about the other kids? That's the sheepdog response. See, we're taught to believe that our Africanness is of no value. So we can't stand on it, we can't build on it. The Africanness is of no value. It is, in fact, what I share with my teachers, culture is to humans as water is to fish. It is everything. But we're not taught that culture is so essential to our survival. We're taught that we can just adopt anything, be anything, take anything. We're not taught that the law of non-being is being violated when, in fact, you don't build your development and culture. Science tells us that culture is the medium of development. In the laboratory, we put the specimen in a petri dish that's called culture. Think about it. Culture is the medium of development. Well, if our task is to develop African men and women, what's the medium? What medium do we develop them in? What petri dish do we put them in order to develop proper human beings? The schoolhouse should be that place. The home should be that place. Those are the mediums of development, but because we lost control of those, we thought we were trying to be integrationists, when in fact we were engaging in responding to the Maafa. See, the Maafa, you can't integrate with the Maafa. You can't integrate in a system that says that for 100 years, every single day of the year, this country had celebration around the lynching of black men and women. That's beyond human comprehension and convention. For 100 years, people gathered together, had picnics, brought their children around, had picnics just to lynch a black man. And then after lynching the brother, or the sister, because it was both, after lynching the brother, burnt his body, and then young white boys would demonstrate the power of their manhood to their girlfriends by being able to reach into the burnt body and pull out the liver of this man to show that they were real men. That's beyond human comprehension and convention. That's the Maafa. So now we're talking about integrating with a kind of people that see that as appropriate human conduct. We got to have clarity in our analysis here. We got to have clarity about what the issue is here. We need to understand. We need to understand that our culture is the medium of development. Culture is all pervasive for humans to develop, just as water is all pervasive for fish to develop. If you catch a fish and pull them out that water, fish get trouble. Fish eyes start bucking out their head, fins start flapping, lips start dribbling. Just as you see some of these dope fiend people in our community, they're out there culture. You see the signs. It's the same signs. You can see the physical trauma. You can literally see the physical trauma of Africans on the faces of our children because they're out of their culture. Culture is to humans as water is to fish. You all from the Carolina Islands know that if you take a saltwater fish, sometimes call them saltwater geese, you take a saltwater fish out of that salt water and put the saltwater fish in fresh water. The saltwater fish makes a rapid adjustment to the fresh water, otherwise it dies. Saltwater fish, think about it, saltwater fish have a certain characteristics. They're bigger fish. They have more color. Their fins are more elegant. They swim with a certain rhythm that saltwater fish men can look down the stream and see a saltwater fish woman and know that it's a sister based upon the way she moves. Saltwater fish have a certain characteristic. Saltwater fish you see saltwater fish will come together, male and female, and they'll touch each other's lips in this way, as if the saltwater fish was saying to the sister saltwater fish, God must have been showing off when he made you. I mean, just a certain arrogance that the saltwater fish has. But take that saltwater fish and put it in fresh water. Saltwater fish shows different kind of behavior. Saltwater fish begins to wonder why it doesn't look like freshwater fish. Saltwater fish begins to think maybe it can get some fin straightening ointment in order to make it feel better. Saltwater fish begins to go to NYCC and Stanford and Yale and come away talking about, I feel better because I've had an education in the best freshwater fish universities, and I've developed a taste for freshwater fish food. I just can't seem to eat that low kind of saltwater fish food. Fresh saltwater fish begin talking about, we got a problem here. We got to get together because we're not getting access to education. We got to have us a saltwater fish civil rights movement and try to figure out how we can get into the universities, get into the jobs. Saltwater fish teachers who aren't able to explain why when they do everything they can to educate saltwater fish kids, the saltwater fish kids still don't learn. And they begin to say, maybe there's something wrong with them saltwater fish kids. Maybe the problem is that they come from 125th Street. Maybe the problem is they come from the projects. Maybe the problem is that they got single-parent saltwater fish mamas. That the problem is not the educational milieu. The problem is something in the children. Saltwater fish begin to talk about that they need to understand why these saltwater fish children act up in class all the time. They can't seem to sit still. We got to get some saltwater fish Ritalin and try to give them a shot to calm them down, to make them educable. The saltwater fish begin to talk about the real problem here is that we learn from our freshwater fish psychologists that the saltwater fish have a low self-esteem. Low saltwater self-esteem. And then ultimately, we got to get them some saltwater fish role models. Some old saltwater fish who have learned how to be good freshwater fish and hook up those children to those freshwater fish role models. And then it begins to be explained that the problem with the saltwater fish community is they got rampant teenage pregnancy. The problem with the saltwater fish community is that there's drug addiction in the saltwater community. The problem with the saltwater fish community is that them saltwater fish men don't respect their women. That you got to do something about them saltwater fish men. And you start hearing this crazy conversation. You hear saltwater fish women saying to their saltwater fish daughters, girl, you got to go for yourself. You can't depend upon no saltwater fish, man. You can't defend. What have they done for you lately? Tell their boys, tell them those saltwater fish boys, you just like your no good saltwater fish daddy. You a dogfish. You see the insidiousness of this when you're outside of your culture? Because we all know, we're so bright in this room that we know that this little tale, this little example is easy to solve. You want to help the saltwater fish. Put some salt in the water. That's all you got to do. Put some salt in the water. And that really is, almost as a parable, that's what African-centered education is about. African-centered education understands that we have been de-spiritualized. We have been de-Africanized. And that if we are able to save ourselves, we must put some Africa back in the process of development. The Petri dish will not develop us other than to create some aberrant, distorted, vulgar representation of who we really are. So the Petri dish must have saline in it if it's to produce our people. Otherwise, we see the results of the despiritualization. You all see it in our communities every single day. Depression, alienation, racial rejection, gender confusion, self-negation, mental illness, drug addiction, alcoholism, poverty, ignorance, hopelessness. Black folk were able to struggle against the most powerful system of human degradation with hope. Hope I'm going to get to Canada. Hope I'm going to get down the block. We had hope on our side, and that was important. It is important because hope is the construct that gives people the ability to envision a different day. Take hope from a people, and you, in fact, have totally dehumanized them, despiritualized them. Helplessness, homelessness. Think about that. Homelessness, it amazes me. Black folk have always knew. When we made these great experiments, I see everything experiments, we said South was rough, we're going to head up north. We took them river roads up north, went to Detroit, and went to Chicago, went to New York, and we established places, and then we would send for our folk to come join us. But if things got bad, we knew we could go back down the road. So when things got rough, we would take your children and send them back home to Big Mama. You take your babies and send them to your uncle, and there would always be a home to go to. If things were good, just the reverse. If things were good up north, you would send your children up north, and your brother or your cousin would raise those children as their children, because we always established home. We have black people today saying that their strategy is to unionize their homeless group. Other than the fact that we knew all the time, go back home to mama's kitchen table and get it right. That's all you had to do. Things got bad in Harlem, knock somebody in the head, hit the number, whatever, get some money, and go back home. And then when you got it together, you'd come back and try it again. We do it all the time. But that metaphor, that icon of mama's kitchen table is important for us. It helps us with clarity. When we have confusion about our values, about our culture, we need to go back home to mama's kitchen table. Mama's kitchen table, in terms of philosophy and intellect, is the Nile Valley. That's mama's kitchen table. And so when we get confused, go back home to mama's kitchen table. And when you go back home, then you begin to rebuild and understand that there's a value system that allows us to re-spiritualize ourselves. See, this issue about education is not just making us better workers. It's not even making us eligible to go on to college. Education is a process, a systematic process of reproducing and refining the best of ourselves. I should see in my great-grandson the best example of my great-grandfather. If I can't see that, I've done something wrong. And as we went through these processes of integration and process of acculturation, and we look at our own children, we wonder, who is this child? Where'd they come from? And we start having this quiet dialogue in the house about that. That's from your family. And that's from your family. The fact of the matter is, that's your people, right? The fact of the matter is that what we're seeing is an indicator that the process has been violated. The process has been violated. When we moved to the suburbs, we did all this stuff under the good life. And we start seeing all these mental illness happening. We see our children doing strange things. It's because there was no salt in the Petri dish. The Petri dish was nice now, split level, 4 or 5 bedrooms, you know, BMW out front. I mean, it was a nice Petri dish. But there was no salt in the Petri dish. And consequently, our children end up being strange caricatures of what is to be an African man or an African woman. So we have to understand this notion of the despiritualization is the critical piece. And these institutions, schools, homes, churches, institutions are places where you reinforce the values that you define as essential to your humanity. And I want to argue with you that the essential value is the spirit. It's the spirit. And I don't want you to run and go to church now, because even though I think it's good to go to church. I mean, a lot of you go to church more often, but here and don't hear. But the spirit is not, the spirit, again, my quest here is truth and intellectual clarity. The spirit is what makes us real, not our bodies. The spirit is what makes us real. Spirit has to be defined because of our training. We hear spirit, we immediately go to spirituality, and from there to religion. And religion takes us to 11 o'clock on one day of the week. You see, so, but don't do that with me. Understand that spirit is not spirituality, not the same as spirituality, nor is it equal to synonymous with religion. Spirit is the energy, the force, the power that is both the inner essence and the outer envelope of human existence. The spirit has no boundaries. It is the inner essence. It is what makes me alive. But it is also the very thing, the energy, the power, the force that makes this universe, everything that is knowable as well as unknowable, connected. That's what the spirit is. The spirit is important because the spirit serves to ignite us. We can't be alive. Every single African philosophy, every single African belief system starts with the spirit. You don't see Africans talking about, can we intellectually debate the existence of God? I mean, that don't exist. I mean, we don't go there. That doesn't exist. There's some things that I can't be without it being around, and the spirit is that issue. The spirit ignites and enlivens us. It is the spirit that causes us to have a simultaneous connection between our metaphysical state and the ethereal extensions of the world. That's a highbrow way of saying that when your grandmama started to rub her elbow and say, I don't know, I've been thinking about Hattie Mae. I better go call her. And when she called back to Macon, Georgia, or jump off Alabama, and she talked to Hattie Mae, something extraordinary had occurred in Hattie Mae's life. That spirit. That spirit. Hattie Mae's boy thought that he was taking some powdered sugar across the street for a friend and got arrested for trafficking cocaine. Fool, stupid. Or Hattie Mae's cousin hit the lotto and she's on her way back to Africa. She could be good. It could be good or bad. It could be good, negative or positive, but something extraordinary happened, and it is our spirit that touches us. Spirit is this issue that connects us up between the super or the supra world of the deities, the orishas, the gods, and the interworld of other human beings, as well as the inner world of ourselves. Spirit is the most critical factor for us to begin dealing with in terms of how do we shape the educational process, the developmental institutions to allow us to reveal this, what I now call spiritness, as distinct from spirituality. Spiritness pertains to the condition of being a spirit. We are spirits. Spirituality pertains to having the quality of being spiritual. It's like the gospel. It's like music. It has a certain quality. It causes a certain response. But it is not who you are. It's not the essence. It is this notion that the Kemetic teachings really are leading us back to, and I believe it is the connection to that spiritness that allowed us to create human contributions to civilization that have not been replicated by no man, and not even replicated by us. You know, when the Japanese went in the Kemet and tried to build the pyramids, they failed because they didn't understand we weren't doing architecture. Not in that sense. we were building the true Masonic understanding of the evolution of the spirituality of our people, transforming from lower animal physical beings to higher, greater spiritual beings. That was our masonry. And because of that masonry, we were able to build pyramids that no one else has been able to replicate again, except for us. We can do it if we, in fact, begin to struggle with this notion of spirit. It is the spirit that, when a people understand it, are able to have connection with this concept of human integrity. We don't have contact with a sense of human integrity. That's why we allow anything to happen to us, and or we will do anything. Because we're not tied to our sense of human integrity, because the spirit notion has been removed from us. Someone else defined, remember, power is the ability to define reality. They have other people respond to your definition as if it were their own. Some other folk define the spirit as something belonging to religion or something belonging to non-intellectual. And so we end up not using the spirit as a basis of intellectual analysis or rebuilding human civilization. It is that spirit that is the instinct that allows us to resist dehumanization. It was the spirit of Africa that allowed our ancestors, immediate ancestors, to say, while we are enslaved, we are not slaves. And we got our best thinkers talking about American slavery. We were never slaves. We understood that we were locked up. We understood that on this day, someone got the advantage. We understood that we had to do certain kinds of things that we would not ordinarily do if we woke up on a sunny afternoon and felt the breeze of God and made some choices about what we were going to do with our energy that day. But that's enslavement. And so it is the spirit that allows you to resist dehumanization, to resist oppression. It is the spirit that gives you the capability to contemplate. And this is high-level human functioning, to be able to contemplate human liberation while you're enslaved. To be able to even contemplate that I can be free while enslaved can only be ascribed to the presence of the Spirit. It is the Spirit that also allowed us to contemplate notions of freedom, notions that we, in fact, will be victorious. It was the Spirit that caused Marcus Mosiah Garvey to imagine what black people could do. It was the Spirit that caused John Coltrane to reach down into the unknown and pull out a music form that no one else had ever even imagined. That's the Spirit. That's educating our children. When we are able to educate our children so they understand that they have the capability of doing it even before it presents itself. See, that's power of education. That's what African-centered education is really moving toward, and that's what frightens our enemies, because they know that they have been able to convince us through the Maafa that when I go to the blackboard and do algebra problems, math problems, abstract thought, half of, if not 90% of the black kids are going to look down on their desk, because the strategy, the sheepdog strategy that they've been taught is that look down so the teacher will not call upon you because you're dumb and you don't want to be embarrassed by showing your ignorance in public. If we have African-centered education, when Miss Jones goes to the blackboard, our little Abdullah will walk up beside and start writing the answer while she's writing out the problem. That's education. That's the power of education, when you have the spirit that you don't have to worry about what it is, because whatever it is, I can handle it. That's the kind of education that spirit does. It is being a spirit that makes this issue critical for us. Because as we sit, if you think about it and sit and listen to our conversation, listen to the discourse, it's not talking like this. It's talking about strategies for how we get our piece of whatever it is, and now we call it Afrocentric, because that's the popular word now. But no one's talking about what is essential and fundamentally different about what education has to be for us. And I offer to you tonight that it has to be a spirit education. It is the spirit that when you analyze spirit, you see that the spirit, this may be decidedly psychological, and that's okay, because psychology, originally, before it got bastardized and distorted, was psyche, which came from saku, out of ancient Kemet, which was the illumination of the spirit. So psychology literally means the study of the illumination of the human spirit. Little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine. The illumination of the spirit is what we have to begin talking about. It is that spirit that causes us to have the experience. Think about your own lives. Don't make this abstract. Think about your own lives, your own growing up, your own feelings as children in your homes. It was the spirit that you experienced the urge and the desire to do good. Ask yourself, why do children's faces light up and smile? Because they want to do good for their parents. No one taught them that. No one taught them that. They look, their eyes light up, they smile when you say, baby, you just did good. They just go wild because that spirit is the urge. It's a human urge, a human desire to do good. It is that same urge that politically, if I can make a minor footnote, politically got us confused. Because we believe that other people operated with the same urge and desire to do good, and all we had to do was to show ourselves to them in some integrated classroom, and they would accept us. But they were operating on Maafa, not on spirit. You see? And so we ended up, no matter what we do in terms of integration, they're still operating, how do I reach in and pull out your liver to show that I'm a man? You see, so that notion of spirit is a critical one for us to understand. It is the spirit that also eventuates, results in us having systems, us inventing systems that are based upon an ever-expanding love and feeling of goodwill. Even in our child-rearing practices. Our children do something that the house says is wrong, but based upon how they present their case, we might give them a pass. We might give them a pass on that issue. But the Maafa people say, no, you got to be systematic. You got to beat your child down every single time they do wrong. But our parents understood that there's an ever-expanding love and goodwill. It was that notion, ever-expanding love and goodwill, tied to an ancient philosophy of human perfectibility that caused us to do something that I always like to talk about. All of us know that on one day in the middle of the month, when money ran out, your mama would send you down the street to Mrs. Jones' house to get a cup of sugar, to borrow a cup of sugar. And when you brought that cup of sugar back to your mother, the moment, literally, the moment that the pound cake was cool enough to cut, your mama sent a piece of pound cake back to Miss Jones. Now, what was that about? See, what was that about? If we, in fact, operate based upon a Western notion, then the relationship, the contract, required 16 ounces of white granulated sugar to be returned to Miss Mildred at the time that you were able to have it. But our culture, our spirit, says that you always give back better than you receive. You make it more better than what you got it. Hatshepsut said that when I found this temple, it was in ruins. And when I leave it, it will be better in grandeur and glory than I found it. That's our way. The pound cake is more better than the cup of sugar. Mama could have sent back a cup of sugar. She could have been totally westernized, and she could have decided strategically to send the cup of sugar back late at night when Miss Wilson was tired, so she could not see that she had not sent back 16 ounces, but sent back 14 ounces, and get away with it. How many of us operate that way? Because we become sheepdogs and not understand our own divinity, human being, when you engage in non-Machian principles. We need to see that. Ethical character becomes important for us. There's a real political problem here, because as we start talking about taking back our schools, this system has said there's a real law about the separation of church and state. Because they see ethics, they see spirit as church stuff, as religious stuff. When in our culture, it is not church stuff, religious stuff, it is everyday stuff. It is how we live as a people. It is the spirit that causes us to have a desire for order and beauty. African people don't thrive in disorder. African people, I mean, look at our proverbs. Baby, God don't like ugly. What's that about? Where that come from? What does that mean? You know, it simply means that your beauty Your beauty is tied to your conduct. Why did Martin Luther King reach deep in that unknown place when he was trying to make an analogy to talk about what is essential and came up with that notion about judge me on the content of my character and not the color of my skin? He reached in a deep unknown place. It was called the spirit, the culture. And every time when you analyze our human processes, we do it all the time. We reach into the culture and we pull out things that belie themselves, that show themselves to be who we are. It is the spirit that also gives us an emotional sense of divine agency. Africans believe in divine agency. There is an agent that is a higher order agent, that the divinity is in us, but then there is a hierarchy. But the hierarchy is not based upon domination and destruction. The hierarchy is based upon nurturance and support and development. And so every one of us recognizes that day in our childhood when we went to Big Mama's house, Madea, Ma, Big Mama's house, Granny, and your mother's mother told your mama to leave that child alone. And you said, damn, mama got a mama. Mama got a mama. We were speaking, even though we didn't know it, we were speaking to the recognition of divine agency. Take the terms back. So we need to have a discourse, but our intellectual discourse needs to be with our concepts and terminology. That there is divine agency, and that divine agency is based upon the wisdom of eldership. And so the 14-year-old is responsible for the 12-year-old. The 12-year-old is responsible for the 8-year-old. The 6-year-old got a baby up in their arms trying to hold him as it's wobbling, because each of us know that we're responsible for the reproduction and the refinement of the best of ourselves. And that divine agency goes all the way up to God. But we all know that in our houses, in our homes, God didn't rule. Mama ruled. Mama ruled. Mama was the one that looked at you. And in looking in your eyes, she helped you to straighten up your back. Mama was the one that inspired you to believe that you could do it when someone called you a nasty nigger. Mama was the one who said simply, you my baby. You my child. And just by saying, you my child, she wiped away and defended you against the assault of the Maafa. Now we got mamas saying you a no good nigger. That's the Maafa. That's the danger. We're off our center. That's the issue of Afrocentricity. That's why this is not just some intellectual, pedagogical masturbation that academicians are playing with. The Afrocentric movement is a life and death struggle. We cannot come out of this. We cannot come out of this just adopting another paradigm that someone's going to call multicultural or interethnic or everybody get around or can't we get along. What all that stuff that they create is not going to happen. We have to recognize that the discourse has to be about our concepts and on our terms. The spirit, I would suggest to you, is that which gives the magnetic pull away from being mere low animal existence to a higher, nobler, better spiritual existence. It is the spirit that causes you to know better even when someone has not told you what is better. That's that magnetic pull. Our children come to the world with God in them, with the spirit in them, and they do know better without us telling them that. But now we're following God's, not our own. Following other people's theories, other people's models, and we're internalizing other people's meaning of our human beingness. We got to be healed. We got to be healed. We got to say this is family business here. Other folks got their Holocaust. They developed strategies for that. Africans got to come together, and we got to talk about family business, about what is healing. Every single issue. And we know from our teachers, from the ancient ones, that the healer was one who saw beyond the present or even tomorrow. The healer could see at a time decades away and wrote prescriptions based upon you meeting the moments of future times far away. Not do we get a summer grant. You see, we're operating that way. We're operating based upon the now. We got to have vision that allow us to see that we're producing, we're educating children, not for the the logic that we hear in the academy today, that what you educate children for now is the job they're going to have 25 years from now. That's tomorrow. We have to talk about a long-distance vision of our humanity and develop systems of education that way. The ancients teach us that the healer works for results that are invisible to them to see. That means we have to have courage. Part of the dilemma, part of the difficulty of the African-centered movement is that we as educators haven't been taught that one of the critical variables, one of the critical components of your ability to be an educator is courage. Courage. We don't have courage to reach into the unknown and pull out the spirit that guides the education of our children. If white folk have not written it down, have not packaged it, have not put a bow on it and sold it to us, we don't believe it's good education. We have to have courage to recognize that the Afrocentric scholars have only raised up the term. You hear me? We only have raised up the concept. We don't have the processes laid out in detail. Different places are farther along that path. But for the most part, we are reclaiming something, and we have to reinvent it. Reinvent it from the essence of ourselves. It is healing work that we're doing, not education. Interesting enough, in Kemet, the belief was that humans have a capacity of being teachable and perfectible. On the normal pattern of development, it is a perfecting process. When you've gone astray, then you've got to teach them how to be who they are. Seems to me that we are at the teaching stage, even though we want to get to the perfecting stage. But we have to teach ourselves who we are before we can perfect ourselves to be more better than what we are. That's our task. It is our tradition that tells us that the healing work is to recognize, not as the European says, that health is the absence of disease. That's crazy, but we buy it all the time. Our ancestors teach us that health is a state when everything that should work together does work together. That's what health is. Health is in your bodies when everything that should work together does work together. Health is when you're working, when you're with your old lady, and everything that should work together does work together. Health is in the community, when the black community, when the business community, and the religious community, and the social community, and the education community, everything that should work together does work together. But if we got people breaking for themselves, running on their own, then we have disease in our community. If the parts of our bodies don't work together, that's a state of dis-at-ease, disease. So we have to begin to define these things for ourselves. We have to re-spiritualize the conversation. We have to begin talking about how does the Spirit enter into our beingness? How does the Spirit enter into our becomingness? How does the Spirit enter into the question of our belongingness? See, we belong to each other. And that's the most important of the B's, is belonging. We belong to each other. Our children belong to each and every one of us. That's why the old folks would whip any child's behind that did wrong, because they understood that all the children belong to all the adults. We got children now talking about they got their lawyer to come and get you because you spoke to them wrong in class. Because we have lost the belonging. Belonging is an important thing, because belonging is a state of being that one feels their connection to the whole. Part of our pathology is that we are operating now not feeling a connection to the whole. We are walking around as human beings wondering whether we can have an invitation to speak to another black person. That is unbelievable. It is unbelievable, because we have lost the sense of belonging. Our healing has to occur in that. Belonging, being, becoming. And I think there's some techniques that we can begin to look at. I'm just going to speak to them, but I'm not going to talk about in depth of them. But retentions, as a scientific concept, we should look at. Retentions, the act or power of remembering. Are there things that we can do in the classroom that causes our children to remember? It's all in us. See, the spirit never dies. It's all in us. So maybe the way you set up the classroom in terms of the placement of chairs, how children sit, how they stand, how they enter the classroom could create retention, would stimulate the retentions to cause them to remember their greatness. See, maybe doing this stuff, sitting in rows and columns, keeps us from remembering. That if it's in us, we just have to recall it. Maybe having our children learn, even if they don't understand the words, learn African language songs and just be able to sing an African song. The sound of the song stimulates the inner ear and causes them to remember that they invented mathematics. Why are they afraid of algebra? You see, there's a technique I want to suggest that we explore. Let's think about this notion of retentions. There are residuals in us. Residuals that are based upon this notion of spirit. A residual is the residue that is left over, the remainder of an original form. Again, is it possible that there are residuals in our psyches, in our saku, in our spirit, that we in fact have left over, remainders, and doing certain kinds of things, those residuals stimulate in us an ability to master higher order thinking? Now, I may be just tripping here. I may just be going off, but I suggest that that's the role of the scientist, is to posit the possibility that you haven't thought about, and then empirically let us test it out and see, in fact, if it could be rejected based upon some null hypotheses. We, in fact, should think about these things. Residuals, the stuff that's left over. Is it possible that the stuff that was left over when Reverend Jones told the choir to play that song I love so well, because I'm going to invite the Lord in this here house, and when he did that, and the gospel choir began to sing, and something in you caused your hand to rise, and you began to do this, and we got real serious, you did this, and is this not the sign of Ka, the spirit? Maybe it's a residual. Maybe it's leftover. See, is it maybe a leftover that when the brothers did good on the football field, they would come up doing high fives, given in slow motion the sign of the Ka? Maybe it's leftover. They could have grabbed their knee. They could have tripped their nose. They could have did anything. They did that. Is it a possibility? Is it a possibility that the sign of righteousness is this, what some people call the Mason square? And when brother gets out of pocket, sister comes immediately with her hand on her hip? A residual, a leftover to remind you, black man, that you are not right. You have not been right. You have violated a principle of the cardinal virtues of Ma'at when we didn't even know nothing about no Ma'at. See, these residuals are something for us to ponder, to think about, the possibilities, that there's a way to recover, to put some salt in the water by stimulating these. Is it possible that these young brothers who came primarily out of New York and were immediately defined away from themselves as little rappers who later evolved to gangster raps, but when they in fact came out bursting on the world, they came out like this? All that stuff. But is that not this, which is the sign of the double crossing in ancient Kemetic law that speaks to life after death and the permanence of this? And it was in fact true when they said, you can't touch this, that they were really meaning in the deep structure of our culture that we are invincible, that the spirit never dies. See, the residual becomes an important point, the notion of residual becomes an important point for us to look at. This idea of resonance is an important one for us to consider. Resonance, a scientific term. It represents the state of a system that vibrates in a like vibration against an energy that it is close to. You take what's that thing called, a music thing that they hit in the music? You all know music, the little tuning fork. And that vibration causes a like vibration in the keys of the piano. Is it possible that when Dr. J and Professor Clark and John and Dr. Ben are taking these black folks every single year back to Africa, and we stand close to living Africans, that we start to vibrate, not those Africans that come over here necessarily, because they got Africa sheepdog version. They're going to the Africa sheepdog farm first. I was trying to be polite. Leave me alone. Let me take it myself. But the point I'm trying to point out is that as we begin to make contact with ourselves, as we stop thinking that Africa is the land of Tarzan, and Africans on the continent stop thinking that to come to America, avoid those black criminals, as we get close to each other and begin to talk with each other and have dialogue with each other, we begin to compare and see that the way in which his mama from Ghana raised him is the same way as my mama from Alabama, the same way as your mama from Brazil. When we had a conversation, we begin to vibrate. The resonance. You see, the energy is there. Is it not that energy that causes us, that vibration, that causes us to find things in that unknown place? That our young people start talking about, yo, what's up, yo? Is it possible that somewhere in that unknown place that they tapped into the Mendi, and the Mendi, whose term yo literally means thought or will, which takes form, which makes itself manifest. I can say you into being. So little brother saying, yo, I'm in charge of this stuff. We don't even see ourselves because we've dislocated ourselves from the spirit that gives us our human beingness. This notion of young people saying hecka. Hecka, we thought they were saying, well, they're being polite because they're around adults and they don't want to say hell of a. They're saying hecka. But is not hecka that unestimable quantity that the ancients in Kemet talked about as a concept that represented? It's so great and so grand, you can't even count it. Thank you. That's too much time. Here, take some back. This notion of resonance becomes important. And the final one is romance. I want us to take charge of romance. Take charge of romance. We run around thinking romance is what we see on Days of Our Lives and Turn Over Tomorrow and Get Back Yesterday and all those things in the Harlequin novels. But romance has to be defined from our center, from our spirit. Romance is a state or a condition where one holds, values, and treasures another to an extent that your love, your care, and your affection sustains them, promotes them, causes them to be nurtured, inspires them. Romance is that concept that says that when I wake up in the morning and look into my woman's eye, I believe that I can go beyond what I thought was my limitation. She inspires me. She inspires me. That's romance. See, romance is important for us to begin to talk about understanding and defining it for ourselves. That's that spirit. That's that spirit connection. When I and this one was cool, but out in California, when I talk to them about my woman, some sisters get upset. Say, don't be talking about I'm not your woman, you don't own me, I'm my own woman, I don't need you. Calm down. Sheepdog. Sheepdog. Understand that our notion of romance says that there is self in collective cherishment. That it is the contact with you that helps me to comprehend that you are essential. And so when I say you are my woman, I am saying you are essential to me, just as my hand is connected to my arm. It belongs to my arm. My eyes belong in my face. My heart belongs in my chest. My woman belongs connected to me. And when you leave me, and brothers will testify, we don't know what to do. We go crazy because something essential has been taken away. And because we've been trained like sheepdogs, we don't see that it's been a spiritual disconnection. We see that you belong to me. I'll drive around your house. I'll cut out your tires. I'll put sugar in your tank. I'll go to your job. I'll do all those crazy things because what we're operating from is that the essential connection, the mindness, has been destroyed, has been disrupted. The my woman, my man that black people just said naturally was because we had tapped into that unknown place that says we belong to each other. We belong to each other, meaning we are essential to each other. I cannot be and be disconnected from my complement. But now we follow someone else into the sheepdog yard, and sisters talk about, I'm independent, this means that I can't do this, you can't do that, you need help. You need to see yourself a doctor. The problem here is that we don't have the ability to define our reality. Remember, power is the ability to define reality and to have other people respond to your definition as if it were their own. As we rebuild education, we have to be clear that there is something called an African-centered core. An African-centered core, and that African-centered core should guide the development of everything from teacher certification to classroom practice to curriculum design to educational research. What is our grounding philosophy? Can't come from Europe. What are the essential precepts that guide the law, that guide what we do in the class? What are the foundational virtues that we know that we talk about in terms of the cardinal virtues of Maafa? What's the operational concept for education that talks about character development? Is there an educational credo that we swear allegiance to? See, we can't no longer say just because you went to Cornell that you now can teach our children. We need to have a credo that speaks to what you promise to do. What you promise to do. The Bantu people will say when they send their children to school, after 16 years, the parents will meet with the teacher, and they will simply say, we loaned you our children for the last 16 years. When do you pay us back? That is the question. Education must pay us back. And the only currency that is acceptable in Africa is African. Thank you very much.